everyone, and welcome to the second WAPC online learning event with Art Bohart. Art, thank you so much for joining us online today. So good to have you.
Well, I very much appreciate being asked.
Wow, yeah, it's great that you've agreed to do it. It's only the second one that we've done together with WAPC, and exciting you're up for the experiment. Yeah. And a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us online too. It's great to have you here with us live. And I guess I keep wanting to say this evening because it's not, it's a winter's night here in the UK. It's not that for everyone, and it's not evening for you either.
No, it's just before noon here. It's an hour before noon.
Yeah, it's a whole different time of day and a slightly different climate, I guess.
Yes, yes. As we were talking before we started, it's fairly chilly here though, 50 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah,
So it feels a little like the kind of winter we get here.
yeah. So you're starting to get your winter, and I think
Yeah.
we're looking forward to some serious snow here in the UK later in the week. So, yeah. Art, I guess we're here to talk about the client as active self healer and the role of empathy in the therapeutic relationship. I guess two things that you've been really passionate about and written extensively about over the
Right.
years. And I wondered maybe we could start by asking you to give us some ideas about your thoughts of the client as self healer. Would that be okay?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to look at the client side and the field of psychotherapy, and I would even include person-centered therapy in that. Don't do that. Um, Yet, if you go back to Carl Rogers, it's so clear that the really prime directive in client-centered therapy is to pay attention to the client with the belief that it's the client who, as Roger said, knows what hurts and knows where to go to make things get better. Obviously, they don't necessarily know that at a conscious level necessarily, but the whole idea is of an organism that is built to learn and grow, and that you do best by helping facilitate that process as opposed to the idea of the therapist being some kind of mechanic who works on the client. And we got interested in this. I'll try to make this fairly short, but we got interested in this when we did a little research study years ago. And I was very interested in Genlin's work on experiencing. And I wanted to explore the idea that what we called experiential empathy responses would be more helpful than non-experiential empathy responses. So we did a little research study where we had um, people talk about their a real but not severe personal problem for a 1 hour session, basically. And they knew it was an experiment. And half of them got what we called experiential empathy responses, and the other half got non-experiential. And basically, what we meant by experiential was that the response was richer and more vivid, whereas the non-experiential ones were more sort of superficial and abstract. And in fact, that's what we found. The clients reported finding the experiential more helpful. They felt the session was more useful and so on. But the more important and unexpected finding was when we listened to the tapes was that the clients that got the non-experiential empathy responses actively and creatively worked with them to make therapy work. They didn't just passively respond. They then took an active role to make sure that therapy would work and go in the right direction. And more importantly and more interestingly is they did it while trying to save the face of the therapist. So they were very polite. You know, they say, "Ah, yes, that was very good, or that was it," and then they would go off in the direction that they needed. And that fit with a lot of David Rennie's research, where he found that clients were highly active, and a lot of this wasn't being shared with the therapist. And so we began to get interested in the idea that it fits perfectly with Rogers, and yet somehow it's like nobody had ever taken it very seriously, except maybe David Rennie. That clients really are active generative contributors to change. And then that fit with the whole idea of the dodo bird verdict, which was coming out about that time, that all therapies seem to work about equally well. So we put that all together and basically argued that it is clients who make therapy work. Excuse me, and what they do is they take whatever they get, as long as it's useful, from a person-centered therapist to cognitive therapist to psychoanalytic therapist, and they're the ones that turn it into gold. And that was our basic hypothesis. And we then accumulated a bunch of research over the years by many different people to support this. And I really believe that it can be said at this point that at the very least, clients are active co-generators of change.
Mm-hmm.
And they do it by creatively, actively working with the therapy environment. They don't just passively receive our responses. They actively work to transform them. They go outside of the office and they actively create their own experiments. They create their own learning experiences. They map what they're learning into their own points of view. They take out of the therapy environment what they need. There's been a lot of different studies that have found that what therapists think is important is relatively rarely what clients think is important. Often clients will say, "It was when you said so and so that things really clicked for me." And that may be something the therapist didn't even remember saying. In fact, if you have tapes of therapy, it may turn out it was something the therapist actually didn't say. That the client just misremembered, or misinterpreted, but it turned out to be the key change event. So my personal belief is that we vastly underestimate the role of the client as a creative self-healer, and that what this means to us as therapists is that I think we really have to much more actively be aware, um, even for person-centered therapists, that we're really sitting across from an intelligent agent who can really be thought of as a therapist in some sense. It's really, therapy is always co-therapy, really. So I'll stop at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, like that was a real key finding that because I could kind of, well, it sounded like you were saying it can be 50-50, but almost like the client is doing so much more than the therapist, and they're the ones that turn the experience into gold.
Well, the research actually suggests that the bulk of variance in outcome is due to the client. And there's no doubt that number one is the clients have to be involved. If they're not involved, nothing happens. And but beyond that, what I've been emphasizing is not just their involvement, but their creativity. That they're not just involved. Um, they're not they're not being good clients, like sitting there and going along with the therapist. It's just that they're actively, creatively shaping what's going on in some sense. So yeah, I really think that what we do is, Maureen O'Hara once said that the client is a real therapist and the therapist is more like a research assistant. And in a funny kind of way, I think that's true.
Mm.
So.
Yeah, when we're thinking about where to rest that title of therapist, maybe we need to think again, actually.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And there's something really important about the creativity of the client, how they take the experience and employ that
Right.
for them.
Right. There's so much. Um, Thomas Mackerel in Denmark did a study a few years ago where he had clients actively keep journals and found that they really map what they're learning into their own universes. And one client came in with the idea that what he needed to do was learn to think positively, and the therapist had a completely different agenda. But over the course of the sessions, the client kept interpreting what was going on in terms of his agenda, and finally he felt he'd really been helped because he had learned to think positively. So he had used the therapy environment to get what he needed um, creatively, but it wasn't really what the therapist thought she was up to or thought was going on even. So
Hmm.
um, that's one example, and there are many other examples.
Yeah, yeah. So the client making the therapy helpful in spite of us, I
Oh,
guess.
I'm absolutely convinced that there are a I can almost guess that are about 50% of clients get better in spite of their therapists rather than because of them. Um, I think that's one reason there are probably therapists around who really aren't all that good, but they have enough success because they aren't so bad that they get in the client's way, if you see what I mean. I mean, I think there are really good therapists that are really helpful,
Mm-hmm.
but I also think there are a lot of therapists who maybe just end up um, being helpful just by being there, even though they aren't maybe actively effective. And fortunately, many clients are able to use that to grow. That's my personal, more radical opinion. I actually almost have never said that to anybody, so but that's what I think.
Well, I appreciate you saying that to us tonight. Thank you, Art. Yeah. But it is the logical conclusion of what you're saying, I guess, that
Yeah,
it's the client's ability to interpret what's going on for in the service of their getting better, their care, that makes such a difference.
right. And now I do want to say that obviously there are therapists who could be actively hurtful. And I probably would guess that really fragile and emotionally vulnerable clients, it's really important for them to have a therapist who's more supportive and attuned. Um, it doesn't universally hold, but I suspect there are a lot of clients that can creatively misinterpret almost any therapist in a way that they find helpful. So.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that sounds like a really important distinction to catch, I guess, in terms of how the client is and the resources that they're bringing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we've got a question in the chat room that kind of matches our second question that we were going to discuss. If that,
Okay.
unless there was some other things, I mean, we can move back and forward, or is it all right to move to that other question?
Yeah, and these three questions all interrelate anyway that we were going to discuss. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I guess they do. So saying, isn't that the point of client-centered therapy, to not get in the way of the client's growth by defining it outside the client's perspective? So I guess in that question, what I'm hearing, there's something about, oh yeah, so we need to make sure we don't get in the way. And the question that we were thinking about was, well, how do you think psychotherapy works? And is it just about getting out the way, or is there more to it than that? Or
It's not just getting out of the way because, you know, there are a lot of clients who um, need something more than just getting out of the way. I don't know how to explain it. Well, maybe I should say what I think about how it works, and then I can
sure,
answer that better.
yeah,
Um, this is less. The first part I said is more based on research. This part's more of my own personal opinion. But my personal belief is that human beings, this does kind of come directly from Rogers. It's my own interpretation of the actualizing tendency, really. I think we are built with the capacity to learn and grow. And I think we have, I think Jevons called it a life forward tendency. And so I believe that under the right circumstances, we're able to creatively generate life forward movement. And I've actually called that self-organizing wisdom. We have a capacity for self-organizing wisdom. The term, I stole it from John Wood. It wasn't my term, but I think it's a really good term. And so why doesn't self-organizing wisdom work more often? I mean, why is it in everyday life that we don't use it more often? Well, obviously, we probably act unwisely half the time as a species. I mean, we certainly don't always act wisely. And it's my belief that self-organizing wisdom operates best in a certain kind of environment or space. And that's a space where, first of all, where threat is reduced. I don't think that our capacity for self-organizing wisdom operates very well when we feel defensive or under threat. It has to be an atmosphere where we feel pretty receptively open, and I really want to emphasize that idea of receptive openness. I think that it operates, I'm almost tempted to say, when we listen well. And hardly anybody talks about listening as a therapeutic change agent on the part of the client. And what I mean by listening is a kind of receptive openness, both to what's coming in from the world, but also what's coming up from within. And you get that kind of integrative flow going on. And it's a kind of thinking, and we all know this kind of thinking, is there's a difference between kind of a tight, analytic, top-down thinking and a kind of thinking like maybe if you've ever written a poem where you try out a line and you listen to it and you revise it, and there's that kind of cycle. Michelangelo said something about that he wasn't really shaping the work of art, he was really liberating it. And in a funny kind of way, I think it's the same kind of thinking where you're really receptively listening to the world and to yourself, and through that process, your organism seems to operate in this more self-organizing, wise way. And things bubble up, new ideas bubble up. Rogers was always fond of talking about things bubbling up. But not only that, but you may even change. It's not a top-down process. It's a whole organism process. You may even change without necessarily gaining a big insight or making a deliberate thing. But you become more integrated and things fall into place and so on. And I think that we have the capacity for that, but I don't think it operates when we feel under threat or defensiveness. And that happens from childhood sometimes, and that's the conditions of worth idea that, conditions of worth make us kind of distrust ourselves in various ways, and so then we're not open in that way. But it doesn't have to be conditions of worth in childhood. It can be a rotten boss at work. It can be under heavy financial stress that you feel very, very threatened. And I think what therapy does, it's not just get out of the way, it's provide an actively supportive, safe environment where the person feels safe to let the defenses down, and they're not guarded. They're not looking out the world for threat, or they're not looking at themselves for threat. And then they allow things to come up, and they can hear, and they can look around at the world, and they can scan, And that's the very conditions that promote creativity. And so that's how I think therapy works. And I actually think it works that way in all therapies, even if the therapist uses this or that intervention.
Hmm.
So, in terms of, I will go on and now say something controversial,
Okay.
um, and which is that um, it goes back to the idea of really trusting the client. If we really believe that clients are active self-healers and we really want to trust them, then we also have to be in active dialogue with them. We have to realize that therapy is a dialogue of two co-creators working together. And that means that I don't think the issue of whether we should be in the client's frame of reference or the therapist's frame of reference is particularly important. I think that's frankly just not a non-issue for me. The issue is, um, can we be in our together frame of reference is the way I put it. I think a lot of David Murphy's work on mutuality, and in a together frame of reference where we're actively sharing. And you've been in this, and others, you've been in a dialogue situation where you bounce ideas off of one another, and both of you get into that flow state, that
Hmm.
receptive listening state. And so I don't think personally think there's anything wrong with sharing ideas or even offering interventions, as long as there's a receptivity and mutuality, where the client really knows and trusts that you really do see them as the authentic source of their own experience, and you're just offering something for them to use if they want to. And if you have that kind of relationship, then I think that then I think in some sense it's a sharing. And by the way, I would also say empathic responses are a form of sharing. Good empathic responses are also sharing. So I'm not saying um, that people who primarily do empathic listening and don't do anything else aren't in dialogue either. They are. That's another form of sharing. And I'm not saying you should be this way or that. I think you need to be the way that you find most comfortable sharing with your client. But if you have that mutuality going, I really think that then clients, their own creativity comes to the fore. And one last point, and then I'll shut up, which is that um, there are clients who really, really take to just being empathically listened to, but there are other clients who actively want to hear from you. And I can't help but think if you really believe that clients are active self-healers, um, why not? So I think you can be mutual. So that's my controversial part.
Wow. Yeah, I've really enjoyed that. What you said, I'm just kind of absorbing it in, and I guess the controversial bit in the person-centered approach is you're saying, well, it's okay to be yourself and to say how to say it in a way that is congruent with us as therapists.
Yeah, with us and with the client. In other words, congruence with the client, if that makes any sense. Congruence between the two of us. A little bit like what's happening between you and me right now. Okay, we're in dialogue,
Yeah,
it's that kind of responsiveness that I think is so important.
yeah, yeah. And I guess that's what you're seeing as the desirable state, as opposed to a desirable kind of response. It's to get into that flow state together.
Yeah, as much as you can, and obviously it doesn't always happen, but
Mm.
at least if you're working towards, well, I don't like to say you're working towards that because I don't think you should try to make that happen. I think that's I think you should be fundamentally client-centered. And that means number one prime directive, be empathically in tune and listen. And that's the number one prime directive. And then everything else can flow from that.
Mm.
But I wouldn't ever try to make a flow state happen. I think that's a
Yeah.
bad idea.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can feel myself kind of going, "Oh, is that what we should be doing? This art? Is that you? Are you telling me this is what I can do?" And but it's like starting from that place of, well, where's
Yeah,
the client, and then to see what flows from there, and
yeah,
that self-organized wisdom or self-organizing wisdom, and the client starts to move, and I guess when that comes in the relationship,
yeah, yeah. I think it comes, and I like Peter Schmidt has used the term co-experiencing. I like the idea that we are co-experiencing together, and so I mean, the best of all times is when there's a mutual creative dialogue, and great empathic responses are creative. I mean, they are when you hear something and you say, "Oh, and it's an empathic response, but it's really right on." That is right coming out of your own creativity too. So,
mm,
yeah,
yeah,
in fact, I would say sometimes it's something that's bubbled up in you. It's like, "Oh, and I
yeah,
get it. You're saying so and so," and
mm,
um,
yeah. That isn't. I'm thinking about what you're saying earlier about that top-down experience. It's not necessarily that. It's coming from all of ourselves, I guess.
right, exactly,
Mm,
yeah.
mm. And is there something about that maybe in the person-centered approach we might be overly protective of clients? Is that?
I believe that, yeah, and it took me a long time to get over that, but I think we get so worried about disrupting their process, and it's so hard to talk about this because the last thing I want to do is encourage any kind of operational thinking where we say, well, this client's here, so I better do that, because I don't think that's a very helpful way to proceed. But um, with some clients that are really fragile and emotionally vulnerable, um, I do think that patient listening is mainly the thing to do, and that quote unquote overly conservative approach is probably really the right thing to do. Um, but I think you just listen. If you're really listening, then you know when you can become more free to maybe share a thought of your own or something like that. And I would just say sometimes I've said when I teach person-centered therapy, and today it's so fashionable to have treatment plans, and I write treatment plan up on the board for person-centered therapy. It's listen, it's one word. And I think that if you're really working at listening, then you'll know. You don't have to plan it. You don't have to say, okay, this client is fragile, therefore I should stay in an empathic listening mode. Okay, this client is not so fragile, therefore I can say some more of what I think. No, that's not the way to go. It's just that moment to moment in tuneness, listening, and if you're really with them, I think it just comes. Things bubble up, like Roger said. Things bubble up,
Mm,
and you can say, what, I had a thought now, and how does that sound to you, or something like that.
yeah.
So,
I guess because it's that moment to moment movement, it's impossible to operationalize because it's
right,
going to be completely different in every moment with every person.
right,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Mm,
That's why I don't think person-centered therapy is manualizable in any meaningful sense.
yeah. Yeah. That makes so much sense, Art. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We just think about that next moment that hasn't formed yet. It's not arrived. It's not arrived in either of us, client or therapist. It's still.
Right,
Mm,
right. And you got to be there to greet that moment and let it bring to you what is needed to go one step further.
yeah. Yeah, I love that idea of greeting the moment. And just we just so need to be there and be in it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
In the third question, we were thinking about your thoughts on empathy in the therapeutic relationship, and we have been talking a bit about empathy. Were there any other things in particular you were thinking about for today or around empathy?
Yeah, I have several things I wanted to say about empathy. These probably bear more on the field outside of person-centered therapy than person-centered therapy per se, but yet I believe that they may help us understand empathy for us too. And um, so I actually have a little tiny, almost mini lecture prepared here on that, which
Fantastic.
is, first of all, if you look at the history of person-centered therapy, you'll see that at different times, different people have emphasized different ones of the facilitative conditions as the most important. Now, nobody that I know of thinks that um, only one is important. Everybody knows all three are important, but it's like which seems to be the most important. And you get Gerald Bozarth, my good friend Gerald Bozarth, who believes that unconditional positive regard is the most important. And he believes that because he says that the theory holds that conditions of worth are the cause of psychopathology, therefore, logically, unconditional positive regard is the most important. And he would say, I know he would say, and he has said that he's had experiences with clients where he didn't really empathically understand them very well, but they got better anyway just because of his unconditional positive regard. Um, if I understand Barbara Broadley correctly, she placed more emphasis on empathy, and she tended to see that as more central. And then you get Rogers, and toward the end of his life, he placed the most emphasis on congruence and genuineness. So you get, sorry, I'm just shifting position. So you get different people emphasizing different things. Um, I tend to think, and what they anyone would say is that the other conditions contribute to the one that they think is most important. So
Okay.
Bozarth would say that empathy contributes to unconditional positive regard, and probably certainly Rogers would say that empathy and positive regard contribute to congruence and genuineness. Um, my personal belief, I guess, is more toward empathy being number one, though, again, the other two are also virtually equally important. Um, if you ask clients, and again, that's my gig, that's what I've done, and I was look at the research on clients, there's so many studies that find that clients say that feeling understood or being understood is the number one thing in therapy. They don't actually say having a therapist treat me with, well, they wouldn't use such a fancy term anyway, but they wouldn't say having the therapist treat me with unconditional positive regard, or they don't say the fact that the therapist was a genuine person so much. They'd say feeling understood. And I think there's something about feeling understood. My image of that is of you coming into focus to yourself. When you're having a problem, and I had a severe anxiety problem for several years, you if you could draw it, it would literally look like that painting, that famous painting of the anxious person. It would
Yeah.
look like somebody out of focus.
Mm.
And I think that feeling understood, you really begin to come into focus to yourself. And I and I think and I think that that really helps you then begin to get grounded. And when you get grounded, you begin to trust yourself more. And when that happens, um, then things bubble up. You begin to get into that state of, where you begin to become more creative and so on. So I definitely think unconditional positive regard is important to provide the safety, but I also think empathy, being seen by another person, being recognized by another person, seems to be so important. And otherwise, you could just go talk to a wall, but I mean, a wall doesn't criticize you, so but it's not enough to talk to a wall. And I don't think somebody sitting there and just smiling warmly is going to help either. I think it's that sense of being recognized.
Mm.
So that's one thing I want to say. And then the other thing about empathy I want to say is in terms of empathic responses. And I think we all know this, but I'm not sure the field knows this. And that is that anybody can learn to give empathic responses. They're teaching doctors to do this now, physicians. And what I want to say is that um, there's something more to it than the ability to give an empathic response. Now, an empathic response is where I recognize how you're seeing things in the moment. I recognize where you're coming from in the moment. But I can do that from an expert therapist stance. I can be a cognitive behaviorist who knows better for you than you do. And I can still empathically respond to show that I understand where you're coming from, all the while planning in my mind what I'm going to do to make you better. Do you see what I'm
I
saying? So,
do, I do, which is very different from how a person-centered therapist would be using
right,
empathy. Yeah.
exactly. And so even though the therapist is giving empathic responses and they're even showing that they understand where the client is coming from, there's something more to the way I think about empathy and we think about empathy that's really important. And that is that it's going beyond the response. And this is where I would bring in Peter Schmidt's ideas we really want to listen to the other person as a person. And this is where the idea of therapy as a meeting of persons comes in. It's a real meeting of persons. I'm trying to really listen to you right now when you say things and hear where you're coming from, not as an intervention or a manipulation, because I really want to know you as a person, if that makes sense, and because we're sharing. And I think that that's what's really important about empathy is this really genuine respect for another person, and that's where it goes hand in hand with unconditional positive regard, and recognizing the other person as a person, to use Les Greenberg's term, as an authentic source of their own experience, so that I'm not just understanding you so that I can tailor my cognitive behavioral intervention to make it most effective to you. I'm understanding you because I'm really trying to recognize and meet you as a person. So that's what I wanted to say about empathy, because I think that is vastly misunderstood in the field at large at the present time. So I guess that's all I have to say. So.
Well, thank you for saying that and so clearly, Art. Yeah, I'm glad you've got a drink there. I was just noticing your throat sounded like it was getting dry.
Yeah, well, that happens. Yeah, as you may know or others may know, I had tongue cancer a number of years ago, and I had radiation treatment, and my throat gets dry, and I begin to lose the ability to talk, and so on and so forth. So,
Yeah. So having a drink with you there is
yeah,
important.
I have to.
Yeah.
I have to.
Especially when we're getting you to work so hard here to give us
Yeah.
these ideas. And I mean, just what you're saying about empathy, that like the intention behind it just sounds
Right.
so important that it's not a tool so that I can get what I want from you. It's the
Right.
intention towards you. It's to yeah, like to know you and to be with you and vice versa.
Right, and I would
Yeah.
say that is the intention. I think that's well put. That is the intention, and that's got to be the intention. Otherwise, it just becomes a technique.
Mm. Yeah. And that sounds really important in terms of just really noticing those differences, why the person-centered approach cannot be manualized. It's
Right,
not like you
right,
can take these conditions and just apply them as some kind of do this next.
right. As a formula. Yeah, no, it's not an operational approach. It's not where you. It's not. I think of it as it's think of a lot of the other approaches, and I'm not putting them down because they obviously work, but it's not an engineering approach, and it's unique in that regard. It's truly unique in respecting the life thrust of the client and respecting the client as an active self-healer.
Yeah,
I think they're an active self-healer in all therapy, but we're the only ones who really put that center stage.
yeah. Like that, I guess that philosophical stance then informs what the therapist does and how they seek to be in the relationship. It's
Right, right, yeah. And seek to be in the relationship is a good way to put it. I think that's what we always are seeking to be in the relationship between two authentic sources of their own experience.
yeah, it's a real beautiful way to describe therapy, art, and inspirational. You think, oh yeah, just really want to do that. And actually, I'm just noticing a question in the chat room where someone's saying, what can I do to catch myself more often if I have any other intention? And I guess that's what can happen for us. We can find ourselves up to other things or other. I mean, do you have ways where you kind of notice what you're doing? Or
Um, that's a really excellent question because all of us, I'm sure, I mean, maybe I won't say all of us, I can't speak for everybody, but certainly for me, I got seduced for a while into that operational philosophy. And in fact, for a while, I thought I was what I would call a mechanistic Rogerian. And what I meant by that is I got seduced to the idea of using empathy responses to make this happen, or using empathy responses to make that happen. And I um, I got really cured of that real fast because it didn't work with real life human clients. And I guess it works for some people, but it didn't work for me. Um, and so you have to, I think of each one of us as a possibility generator. Each one of us is like um, each one of us is like a city, and we have all sorts of things going on inside. And so we will have possibilities being generated. We have voices inside. Uh, I have the voice of Aaron Beck, and I have the voice of Freud, and I have the voice of Les Greenberg, and of Gendlin, and of Rogers, and of all sorts of different people. And so um, there's a wonderful book, by the way, called After the Fight by Dan Weil. And Weil is not officially a person-centered therapist, but his work, Wile, I'll highly recommend it. But he's very person-centered at heart. And the book is a lot about the therapist process and about how he's working with clients and things aren't going well. And he says to himself, oh no, now what would um, Lloyd down the hall, who's a rational emotive therapist, he would have something to do here that would work better than what I'm doing, and so on and so forth. And then he talks a lot about repeating how to get centered again. And so it's absolutely natural and normal that that happens. So the first thing is um, practice being accepting of the fact that you are a circus inside, and that a three-wing circus, and that there's a lot of different things going to go on, and that you're going to screw up. uh,
okay,
that's one thing that Weil's book is so good at talking about, and and then I just keep repeatedly bringing it back to listening. Um, and but listening not only to the client, remember the best kind of listening is that sort of circle where you're listening both to yourself and to the client. Or you're listening to the two of you together, I think is the best way to put it. So
yeah.
that's the best I can do on that. There's no magic answer in that one. That's a moment to moment answer also. You just do in the moment.
So there isn't a mechanism for sorting
No,
ourselves out as therapists, I guess.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, precisely.
And I think that metaphor of the three ring circus is, as a human, there's so much stuff going on inside us, and just being kind of okay with sometimes that spills over and it screws up things for a while, or just,
Right.
yeah,
Right. Yeah.
to be okay with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because also out of that can people's creativity could come too. So
Yeah. So somewhere in that three ring circus, or in either both of our three ring circus, there's maybe something just emerging that could be the
yeah,
right thing in that moment.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So not to throw it all away. And
Right. Exactly.
there was a question a little bit earlier in the chat room that we didn't get to, but it felt important about supervision and offering supervision and thinking about doing that from the perspective and the intention of seeing the supervisee as a self healer. It feels like an important question. I'm also kind of holding that sense of this supervision in the States and over here in the UK, maybe where that has a different flavour, or I mean, I guess that's.
That well, I'll try to answer that in two different ways because um, most of the supervision I did was in internship classes at the university I taught at. And I was teaching students who were operating because we had a program where they could choose their own orientation. So there were a lot of students operating from different orientations. And so I wasn't supervising just person centered practitioners. And so certainly, nonetheless, I would say in some sense what I've said fits, which is that, yeah, you think of the supervisee as, if not an active self healer exactly, as an active grower, active creative generator of understanding and growth, and your process is to be with them and facilitate that. And facilitating that may include offering your own thoughts. So, if I'm supervising a budding cognitive therapist, and they talk about a challenge of a dysfunctional thought that didn't work, I might give my own thoughts on that, and but it wouldn't be like as me, the expert who knows better. It would be me like, okay, and now what do you think? How does that sound to you? How does that resonate with you? And if you really have the right kind of relationship, they will say, well, no, it's not like that exactly. It's more like this. So they won't necessarily just swallow it, which is what you don't want. If I was just doing pure person-centered supervision, I think I would try to be toward a more pure person-centered therapist, getting them to talk about their client and then trying to empathically understand where they're at, and through that help them develop their own understanding. I thought when you mentioned that, I thought of a story that Dave Mearns told me once, which some of the listeners may have heard about, when he was being supervised by Rogers, and he was working with a very difficult client, and he described it to Rogers, and Rogers said, so do you know what you're doing with him? And Dave said something like, I haven't a bloody clue. And Rogers said, that's all right then. Um, and I think now that's not an empathic response. That's actually a therapist's frame of reference response. But I think it's a lovely response because it's very validating, and it's very trusting, and it's acknowledging the fact that sometimes you don't know what you're doing and nobody knows what they're doing, and you're just supporting them through the dark place. So I like that story, so I had to throw that in. Didn't know if it fit or not, but
Well, I hadn't heard it before, and I love it. Yeah, like this, we can maybe relax from that, always needing to have a sense of where we're going or a treatment
Right,
plan, or yeah,
right, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Thank you for that story. That's very generous. It feels like it fits to me. Yeah. Oh, a comment in the chat room maybe catches what you're saying. Forever beginner's mind.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I really completely agree with that. I think so.
Mm.
That's a if you can do that, and it doesn't mean you can't use your knowledge because you use anything you can to help understand your client and be with them, but beginner's mind means I don't know. I it's Peter Smith's talked about this too. I don't know this person. I can never fully know this person. I'm always approaching them with beginner's mind, wanting to learn about them. All the stuff I know is useful and interesting to maybe help them understand them, but I don't. But it's not. Doesn't know how to say this. Um, it's not expert knowledge. I don't have expert knowledge about them.
Mm.
Um, I still think of Michelangelo sculpting things, and letting the sculpture teach him. I really, he certainly had a lot of expertise, but my guess is he approached the sculpture fresh. I bet with beginner's mind in some sense, and let it teach him as he interacted with it. So yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, yeah. It's just a lovely thing to imagine that he was setting something free or working with the marble to release something or
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
I think I'm holding on to my question because it's like I'm hearing from the chat room first, but I'm thinking about one of the things we talked about almost at the beginning of the hour about there's often what we're doing, the client is making it useful for themselves,
Right.
and there are people who in their work seem to be really, really helpful. And um, I'm just wondering how you would describe that, or what you might notice about those people who manage to really add something extra. And does that question make sense? Or
Yeah. I've never thought about it, so I don't have a ready to hand answer. I was first going to say that you would probably again expect it to be more clients who are somewhat less vulnerable, but then I mentioned Thomas Mackerel's dissertation earlier. I thought of one of the clients he studied who she was an adult child of an alcoholic, and she went into therapy. The therapist was an existential therapist, and she went in. This was in Denmark, and she went in believing that she was going to the rats, which apparently in Denmark means going crazy. She thought she was losing her mind. And as far as I can tell, the therapist didn't really do much in the first session um, in terms of active trying to change her. It was probably more empathic listening and connecting. And she came out of the session and and became incredibly creative after one session. She went and she dug up her brother, who was, obviously also an adult child and alcoholic, and she sat him down, and the two of them compared notes, and they discovered that they both had a lot of self-doubts, and it was probably due to their parents. So she created her own therapy. She also found another adult child of an alcoholic and did the same thing. And through all this, she was, realizing that a lot of her problems were not her personal, but unique to, were due to the kind of background she had. And it was like the therapy liberated her creativity. It was one session, and she was a vulnerable client right at the start. So I honestly don't know. I'm sure, I genuinely can't answer that. It's an excellent question, but I have to think about it more. I I certainly would be aware of the fact that David Rennie's found that a lot of clients get all sorts of insights which they don't share with the therapist. And I I guess just, I don't know. I guess just keep an eye out for creative thoughts they have, little tiny creative thoughts they have, and latch onto them sometimes. Maybe I'm not doing a good job with that question. That's I have to think about that one.
Well, I've put you right on the spot, and I mean, I always think I wondered, and maybe it's a bit unfair to put the question the other way around, but like the things being that you've been describing for the last hour, like in the moments that we're able to be in that place with the client, be in that place with ourselves,
Yeah,
to the extent that we're able to do that, we become more helpful. And I just noticed you saying about when we notice those creative moments
yeah,
and then not letting them slip past can make a big
right.
difference. Yeah.
Yeah, and um, yeah, I would say that. But again, that comes down to then just being really listening and in tune, which is the prime directive as far as I'm concerned, anyway. So
Yeah. Well, I think that's what's so tantalizing and in some ways difficult about the approach, to really become fantastic at it, if that was the right, I mean, that doesn't feel, that's not the right expression, but like there isn't actually a way to do it. It's being in that moment or something, and
right, yeah, and I also want to caution anybody out there who thinks, it means also being willing to stay with all the moments when things are incredibly clunky, when they're not going smoothly, when you feel incredibly out of tune, when you feel like everything you say is wrong. You know,
yeah,
um,
yeah. Oh, I really appreciate you saying that because those can be the hardest times with clients, can they? We just think every time I open my mouth, I just think, oh no.
right, exactly, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, but
But
I
I
guess
do believe that if I do believe the underlying agenda is still being helpful regardless of what you say so much. I think it's you're staying with them, um, you're sharing the difficult places with them, and I think that is helpful even if you're not magically empathically in tune all the time.
mm,
So,
yeah, yeah, like the overall intention and experience is, yeah, so the potency in that as opposed to
right,
each response is,
right. And that comes back to really having that faith that that process between you is going to go in a positive direction, I guess.
mm,
It's no matter how hard it may be in the moment sometimes.
yeah, and it can be hard, I guess. It's,
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
right. Yeah,
just as it can be amazing, it can be, yeah,
right.
so hard. Yeah. Well, Art, I'm just noticing the time with about a minute to go. I just, I want to say thank you so much for being up for such amazing dialogue today. I just really appreciate you being in the moment because I guess you had some things to bring along and you've been really open to what we've wanted to know from you. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. It was very exciting for me because exactly what I'm talking about, I got a lot of insights into my own ideas from talking to you about them. So, so what else could I ask for? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. So we've got that, yeah, some kind of flow or circulation.
right.
And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's taken the time to be with us online as well and to be in that flow with us and to offer us their comments and questions, which feels like it's really stimulated the discussion. So thank you for that too.
I agree. Thank you to everybody.